Fragments of Silicon. Collect all 8 to save the world.
Welcome to the first Fragments of Silicon European interview of 2019, which means we're back to normal, full schedule and all that. Joining us this week is John Shafer of Conifer Games.
Hey guys, it's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. Right, since time is of the essence, we should get right into it. And we'd like to start things by asking, what got you interested in video games, on both a personal and a professional level?
Sure. So when I was young, my parents played actually video games way back in the 1980s. So if anybody's familiar with the old Sierra games like King's Quest and Quest for Glory, we had those on a home computer, and my parents were playing them, and I said, hey, this seems pretty cool. What is this? So that's kind of what got me in originally, but I shifted over to strategy games and historical-based games pretty quickly after that, because history and World War II specifically was a big passion of mine. I was a weird 11-year-old. So from that point, I was into strategy games, and then I came across Civilization when I was in high school. It was actually introduced to me from a history teacher. I don't think he ever expected me to go on and actually work on the game, but it's kind of a funny little coincidence there that they distracted me with something that probably kept me from doing some of my schoolwork. But so I joined Firaxis as a programming intern after being a beta tester for a couple of years, and then I ended up becoming the lead designer on Civ 5, having worked on some of the expansions for Civ 4 before that. And after that, since then, I've gone to a couple different places and started Conifer Games, which is making strategy games as well, and definitely builds a lot on the work I've done in the past.
Indeed. I mean, there's actually quite a bit to unpack there, given that, you worked on probably the name in strategy games. It's like Civilization is probably what you think of when you think of strategy. Or at least certainly one of them, especially of the 4X variety. Anyway, let's see. There's a lot of questions to be asked on that, but I suppose the first one that comes to mind is, did you ever meet Sid Meier?
Yes, I definitely have. He has an office at Firaxis, which he spends a lot of time in, both working and also just playing around with a lot of things. Like he plays the keyboard. He has a keyboard in there. He has a bunch of books. So I would find him in there on Sundays, because I would come in and work on the game, and he would be in there either working or making music or doing something. So I didn't talk to him a huge amount. I mean, he was a busy guy, but I definitely met him.
Right. And it's like, what was it like working on the expansion packs versus being the lead designer of one of the main the main entry to the series?
It's very different. With the expansion packs, the scope of changes that you can make are already pretty limited. Like, a lot of the content that goes into an expansion pack for a game like Civ, it includes things like new leaders in Civs, it includes some scenarios, and then usually you'll have one or two mechanical changes. You just don't have the time or the people to kind of make huge changes. So you're working from the foundation that you already have. So the worst you can do is probably add a terrible espionage system, like seems to happen in every single Civ game. So the stakes are pretty low. With a full entry in the series, though, basically the sky's the limit. You could do as much good or as much bad, as is possible. So you have to be a lot more mindful of the decisions you make. And Civ is a tough game to design. So I know Soren, who was the lead designer on Civilization 4 before I was on 5. He would say that he learned quite a lot, basically being the co-designer of Civilization 3 and then working quite a lot on the Civ 3 expansion packs as the designer. And then he was able to apply those lessons going forward with Civ 4. So I didn't really have as much of an opportunity to kind of sink my teeth in and figure things out. So I had to make some decisions that were maybe a little bit more risky with Civ 5, just because I hadn't had an opportunity to kind of lead things up completely myself from the start. So in a lot of ways, At the Gates, which is the game I'm working on now, is kind of that. It's taking a lot of lessons from other 4X games and my past work and saying, okay, how can we build on that to evolve to a new step for the genre?
Indeed, and before we get to that, I suppose a bit of background on what At the Gates is in order.
Sure. So At the Gates is a strategy game. It's pretty similar to Civilization in some ways. You're on a hex map. There are randomly generated worlds. You start with one settlement, and then you kind of harvest resources, explore the map, and build up. At the Gates is different in that it's specifically focused on the Dark Ages. So you're one of the proto-kingdoms of the early medieval age trying to replace the Roman Empire. And this offers some kind of cool things because there's a closer scope, I guess. So we're able to model things like the seasons. So the maps actually change very dramatically. Every year is 24 turns, so you'll get to see summer and winter, and it changes how much food you produce. It changes how your armies are able to navigate during the winter. You can freeze rivers, so something that might have been kind of an impassable fence before now becomes flat land that you can cross over. Additionally, we can kind of focus on some other cool mechanics, like your settlements are actually able to move around the map. So instead of having a bunch of cities that once you build them, they're there forever, you have one settlement that basically acts as your city, and you can move that around for the first part of the game. But that's all you have. So instead of managing a lot of cities, you have clans who are kind of like characters, and you'll start with 3 of them, but eventually you'll get a lot more than that, several dozen. So it's kind of a character management game. It has some new features, like I said, involving the map, and some cool mechanics like resources that run out. So you kind of have to build your economy more thoughtfully than you might in other 4X games. So on the whole, it adds up to a package that's definitely a more hardcore than a game like Civilization. So if you're a casual Civ fan, then this is probably going to be a pretty tough game for you to play. But if you're a fan of the genre, if you've played Civ before, you're kind of looking for something new with strategy, I think At the Gates will be something that really appeals to you, because from the beginning I've tried to kind of build on what's there, but do something new. It's not just kind of rebuilding or reiterating on the same formula again. It is very new. So even though it might look like Civ, it plays quite a bit differently.
I will say I'm rather interested in the age depicted because, well, it's like we get a lot of Roman strategy games, be it real-time, grand strategy, what have you. But, it's like the period right after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, not so much explored. No.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the reason for why that is pretty clear in that typically in this era you're playing as the Romans. So you want to build the Roman Empire. You don't want to run it as it's falling apart. That's potentially an interesting challenge, but that's it certainly has less appeal than building the Roman Empire. So what works with At the Gates is that the main character, basically the focus of the experience, is completely different. So you're not playing as the Romans who are falling apart. You're playing as new European tribes that are trying to become kingdoms to replace the Romans. So it fits extremely well within the framework of a 4X game, where you start small and you don't really know what's around. You don't have that many resources, but you build up and you build up. It's one of the few elements of at least European history that you can apply that to. The only other one really being the beginning or colonization, and obviously there's a Civ spin-off basically just based around that has been quite popular as well. So I've kind of maybe picked off one of the last ones for at least European history. But no, it's an era that actually works surprisingly well for the 4X formula. So it was actually kind of cool how it came together.
Well, I mean, there's also a Roman Empire focus even in this age, but that's the Eastern Roman Empire. It's like they lasted for another 1,000 years. It's just, they got renamed like the Byzantine Empire later down the road, like much later. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, so what tribes are represented here? Are they based off of like, the real Germanic tribes, the Huns, the Visigoths, and so on and so forth?
Yes, exactly. So there are 10 playable factions, and they range from the Goths to the Huns, the Franks, the Picts. So there's a pretty good variety there. And each one, the way the factions work is actually a little bit inspired by Civ, but also by kind of a roguelike named Binding of Isaac for anybody who's familiar with that game. I've played a lot of that. But the basic idea is that rather than Civ, where you start off with every faction available at the start of the game, and then you can just play whoever you want. At the gates, you only have one faction available to start, the Goths. They're kind of like the vanilla default faction. They don't have any very strong, unique abilities, positive or negative. But all the other factions you have to unlock in the game while you're playing, either by conquering them or by forming an alliance with them, which is pretty difficult. So it's kind of like achievements, except it actually gives you something, and then each of the factions has one or two rule changes that makes them play very differently. So it's definitely a different model for 4X, and it's a good example of how I'm trying to pull in elements from the genres to try and make something that might not appeal to as many people. Like if you aren't that interested in the Alemanni or the Avars, that's fine. But once you've played the game and gotten into it, their unique abilities might be enough to say, oh, that seems really interesting. I want to unlock them and try playing a game as them because they start with a horse archer, or they start with a galley, or there's all sorts of different abilities that the factions have. So I've tried to pull from history so that there are historical factions and leaders, but it's more important that they play fun, and that's kind of been the priority.
Okay. And how long of a period of time is being represented here?
Yeah, so this is the early 400s, which is probably a part of history most people aren't super familiar with. But the basic idea is that this is when roughly the Western Roman Empire falls, or specifically I picked a date just before Rome itself was conquered and sacked for the first time. So it doesn't, it's not aiming to represent history too accurately in that, like in a paradox game, like the way the months and the years pass is very specific, and how events can occur and lifespans are very matched with the pace of the game. And at the gates, it is more like Civ, where the year and the date is more kind of a framing element rather than something too specific. So you might start a game in 400 AD and end it in 410 or 415 or something like that. So it takes place over about 10 years or about 250, 300 turns of gameplay. But yeah, how long the games last really depends on how long you take to think, because it is definitely a game that requires some thinking. But yeah, it's about 10 to 15 years, I would say.
Yeah, it's also a pretty scaled down version of representative history. Like when you play Civilization, for example, you're playing like the entire span of human civilization up to like about when that particular installment was made, or maybe a bit after, like the 2000, 2015, what have you. To focus in on 10 to 15 years is a bit unusual.
Yeah, I think it's a model that potentially works a lot better though than the covering all of history one, because kind of a dirty secret among both hardcore fans as well as designers of Civ is that the first half of the game is fun. That's the part where you have out of the four X's in a 4X, you have exploration, expansion, exploitation of resources, and extermination, conquest. The first half of the game you have all of those, but once you've explored the map and you've filled it up with cities, it's not really that fun anymore. So you have a problem where you have all this, the second half of the game, the second half of history, if you will, that isn't that much fun because you only have the other two of the four X's. So at the gates, the goal has kind of been to encapsulate. Okay, well, let's try to stretch that out. Let's make that not be something that ends halfway through the game. Let's make the whole game include those interesting elements, and that's only possible because I'm focusing more than Civ is able to. Like Civ can't just say, okay, it's the medieval era, we're done, we're done. People would go crazy if there was a Civ 7 and it just ended in like 1500 AD. People would be mad. But with At the Gates, because I was able to kind of start from scratch, I was able to say, how can I build this to make the gameplay work as and be as strong as it possibly can be? And that tighter focus is what allows for that. So there is kind of a trade-off in terms of the appeal of a game that covers all of history is very obvious, but there's some costs to that. So kind of going the other direction means you have a lot of flexibility as a designer to kind of focus on exactly what plays well and what's fun.
Indeed. And in terms of goals and aims of At the Gates, is it just like building your own kingdom, or are there like several pathways to victory?
Yeah, so there are two ways to win the game. You can either conquer a capital that belongs to one of the two halves of the Roman Empire. So in each game, there's a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire. So like I said earlier, all the maps are random. Eventually, I'm going to be adding a really cool detailed map of Europe, but that's not going to be in the release version of the game. That'll come a little bit afterwards. But yeah, so there's the two halves of the Roman Empire, and if you manage to conquer one of their capitals, which is pretty difficult because they have very powerful armies, then you win the game that way. Additionally, you can kind of win through a more economic victory condition that's kind of fun, where you're able to send up to, or you have to send 5 of your clans, so like 5 of your characters, your 5 play pieces. You have to basically send them away for a year to Rome with some expensive equipment, and then that retrains them as a Roman legion. So you're basically contributing your people to become the new soldiers of the Roman army. And when that's done, for each unit, you get that Roman legion back. So you can then use it however you want. If you manage to get 5 of them, then you basically get the ability to say, okay, we run the Roman Empire now, get out of the way. So it's basically like an economic victory condition where you sacrifice some of your characters, you spend pretty expensive resources to train these guys, and then you say, hey, we're the new management, congratulations. So those are the two ways to win. Each type of victory will be easier or more difficult depending on the game. At the Gates generally inherits quite a lot from roguelikes in the sense that it's much more asymmetric from game to game. You don't know what you're going to get. The arc is going to be different. The resources are going to be different. The clans will be stronger or weaker, or easier or harder to manage. But the idea is that every time you play, the game will be different, and that the same thing goes for the victory conditions. It's going to be you're going to have to adapt. You're going to have to change your strategy from game to game, and it's something that even after having worked on the game now for almost 7 years, I'm still really excited every time I start a game, because the challenge and the strategy is different each time. So this is definitely not something that's been true for any of my previous work. So it's pretty cool to still be excited about the game this far in.
Indeed. And you've been developing it for 7 years? That's
just about. Yeah, it's too long.
That's definitely a development cycle. Um, I suppose the question that begs is how many people have been working on this?
Yeah, so I'm the only full-time person that's kind of been true since the beginning. In the first couple of years, I had a couple friends that were helping me out part-time with the art and the programming. And then over the years, I've also hired some contractors and people to help out to produce like the really cool watercolor paintings, to do some music for the game, that sort of thing. So in total, I'd say maybe about 10 people have worked on the game. In terms of the time spent, I would say probably close to 80% of the overall time was just me because as a strategy game, like a lot of the work is just the rules and putting things together and interface and there's just a lot of parts. So yeah, pretty small team and definitely a lot of work. I'm hoping to maybe hire a couple more people full time for the next one.
I, I can imagine. And how does that contrast with working on one of the Civ games?
Oh, it's completely different. I mean, Civ 5, the team ended up around 55 people by the end. I think that's how many people are listed in the credits for the development side. But it's enough that definitely it's hard to keep track of. um, but yeah, no, it's very very different, and I love elements of both. Although, being indie now and having kind of control over everything from like, what the release date is to what features I get to talk about on podcasts and things like that. Everything that goes along with being an indie is great. But of course, again, you don't have that support or that structure. If something's not working, you have to fix it. If there's a bug, you have to fix it. If you want a feature, you have to add it. If the game takes too long, it's your money you're spending. So it makes everything very real in a sense, for better and worse. I mean, if you want to have a family or if you want a more stable environment to work in long term, I mean, games probably isn't the right fit for that, anyways. But being an indie is just, it's completely opposite from that sort of stable lifestyle. So it's, if you're like me and you kind of need that sort of that energy and that challenge that you can kind of sink your teeth into, that's great. But it's not for everybody. So it's you know very different. I like working in office with really passionate people. That's something I miss quite a lot. Maybe in the future I can kind of split the difference a little bit.
Indeed. And I suppose this might be a bit of a hard question to answer, but like, what was the most difficult aspect of developing at the gates, and what was the easiest? If that could be right.
Yeah, it's a tough question. The hardest I would say is probably diplomacy. It's just a really difficult challenge to wrap your head around. I mean, when we think about what makes for a fun war game or what makes for fun combat elements within a larger strategy game, we can kind of come up with some conceptual ideas, like we want it to be like Blitzkrieg from World War II, or you have tanks rolling in planes and infantry coming behind, or it can be more chaotic, like modern warfare, guerrilla warfare, or something. But when you think about what does good fun diplomacy look like what is that? Like, what does that even mean? So just putting a box around what the challenge is, what the task is incredibly difficult to start off with. And then once you've drawn the lines, then you kind of have to do something that nobody's really done that well before. Some of the Paradox games, and then even an old game like Al Centauri, they've certainly had very strong elements that can lay claim to having the best diplomacy system. But even then, like if you look at those individual systems, there's still definitely major drawbacks there. And I think there's not a lot of examples to pull from and say this is how to do it. Let's build from this. Where if you look at almost anything else, like a resource system or a combat system, or how to do multiplayer, anything else. Like there are a lot of examples of things that pretty much work and that you can kind of borrow elements from. But diplomacy, it's just like, okay, even if you look at other genres, like you look at character development in a BioWare RPG or something, like there's people excited and there's a lot of criticism as well. So it's a tough one. What was the easiest? I guess the easiest thing was making the season system cool, I guess. And it makes sense because that was kind of the first concept that the game started off with. Like, even before I knew it was going to be a game in this era about this theme, I wanted to do something with the map, because the map is so essential in a strategy game, especially a 4X game where it's random and you're exploring it from basically knowing nothing at the start. So there's so much potential there, even above and beyond what games like Civ have already accomplished. So at the gate, it's just like, okay, how do we make the map more dynamic? Okay, well, the map can change. What's the most straightforward way of doing that in a strategic way? Oh, seasons. Yeah, that's something that, everybody knows kind of what winter means. So getting that online was really pretty quick, pretty early on in the game. I wouldn't say it was just completely easy in itself, but it was maybe easier than you might expect. But maybe that's kind of related to the fact that I'm just super passionate about it, so I don't notice the work that it takes.
Indeed. Now, speaking of the weather system and the season system, is that pure aesthetics, or does that have an effect on the game?
Definitely has an effect. So one of the most core elements of the game is making sure that all of your people, all of your clans are fed. So you have you start off with a small amount of food, and then each turn you lose one from that stockpile. So from the beginning of the game, you need to be thinking about how to keep your people fed. So it's almost a little bit of a survival game in that sense. It's much easier to collect food during the warm months and during the summer than is during the winter. Basically, during the winter, all the plants die. So if you want to find food, you're going to have to hunt for it, or you're going to have to find like bees, or eat honey or something like that. So it can get a little tough. So you want to be prepared, and you want to plan ahead. So it affects the economic system, and it also affects how units interact with the map. So there's a basic supply system where when you're outside of your borders, a unit needs a certain amount of supply that it can collect automatically from the tile. And in the summer, this is easy. Basically, everybody is fine unless you're marching your army through a desert. But once it starts getting cold, and then especially once things turn to snow, and then possibly blizzards come by and immobilize your armies completely, your units will run out of supply, and then that definitely changes what you can do. So if you were exploring, you kind of have to slow down. If you're launching an invasion, you might need to encamp your army so that they don't die on the way there. If you were harvesting a resource with a forager, like a source of metal or something outside your borders nearby, you might need to slow that down a little bit as well. So if you wanted to set up a new wheat farm or something to help feed your people, if you probably don't want to set that up in like October, because you're not going to get anything from that until the next spring. So it definitely affects the strategy quite a lot.
And what sorts of resource gathering is involved here? Farming, mining, what have you?
Yeah, so there's three categories of resources, basically. They're plants, animals, and minerals. And each category has, I don't know, maybe 10 things in it. So quite a lot of resources in the game. In addition to being a character management game, it is, in many ways, a resource management game as well. Those resources can be harvested basically in two ways. Either you can send a unit out directly, like a gatherer or a hunter, and say, hey, go out there and get me some meat from that herd of deer. And you can do that basically right from the start of the game. You'll produce a little bit each turn, but not a ton. You have some other professions that you can train your clans in to improve the output of those foragers, as they're called. But your overall potential is kind of limited. So what you want to do is transition over to building structures. So building a wheat farm, building an iron mine, instead of just having like a digger go over there and dig up whatever they can find on the top. So this allows you to harvest a lot more, but obviously it requires some wood to build the structures out of, or later in the game it requires stone. So you can invest more and get more out of it, but that's going to be kind of a trade-off that you have to make in the early to mid game is kind of when to switch over your economy and what to do in what order. So yeah, that's kind of how the resource system works.
Interesting. And is there any sort of tech or skill tree in at the gates?
Yeah, so the technology tree is basically based on professions that you can train your clans in. So this kind of being the Dark Ages, there wasn't a huge amount of technological research. So basically, you're just trying to figure out what different jobs you can put your clans in, and this is something that you develop over time. Um, there are 6 different disciplines, and those are basically categories that professions can exist in. So those can be things like agriculture or metalworking or discovery. And each of those has maybe 15 professions in it. And as a clan spends time in a profession, it levels up in that discipline. So if like an explorer is in the discovery discipline, and for every turn that explorer is doing something, or basically just exists at all, it's gaining experience, and then it levels up in that discipline. And that level determines how long it takes to train that clan in a profession of the same discipline. So if you have somebody in discovery, you probably want to kind of keep them in discovery because you can utilize them more efficiently that way. So there's an interplay between kind of the tech tree, what you're researching, and how advanced and how long it takes to train in those advanced professions, and also what clans you have available. The clans each have 2 personality traits that kind of dictate what they're good at and what they're bad at. So depending on what clans join you, the game can play out quite differently, and you're pushed in different directions throughout the tech tree. So yeah, the connection between the professions and the clans is pretty important. So it's something you'll be spending a lot of time kind of looking at, thinking about, and strategizing around.
Makes sense. Right. Before I continue my line of questioning, I want to see if my colleagues here have any questions for you at this point in time.
I don't personally have anything. Like, I will say, like, Forex strategies, I never really got too into, so I don't really know a whole lot about them. So.
All right.
Yeah, you've done a pretty good job with the overview as far as questions I had. I was going to make an Invisigoths joke, but I missed the timing.
Maybe you can do something with the Vandals. Anyway. Well, picking things up, is there an advisor system? And given the period of history, I mean, exactly, like, are you drawing from figures of that age? Like Civilization would do.
So there are no advisors per se. So the closest that comes is kind of with the clans. So the clans are kind of a weird mix, honestly, between characters and like population points. So they instead of having like a population number on your city like you would in a Civ game, you just have however many clans show up and are in your settlement and available to be utilized. But each of those clans has a name, it has personality traits, it has like a little painting portrait. So there's quite a bit of character in the game overall, but those are not historical characters. And in part that's because this is an era that we honestly don't know that much about. Like, we kind of have to infer a lot. And this is kind of nice for me as a designer because I can kind of fudge things a little bit and say, oh, what would be interesting is if, Cerdic of the Saxons acted this way compared with Alboin of the Lombards. I can kind of define those things in a way that you can't really do so much for somebody like Gandhi in Civilization. If you tried to make Gandhi act completely differently from how people expect Gandhi to act, then you kind of have an issue. Of course, there's the joke about Gandhi nuking everybody in Civ, but you know, that's the joke, is that Gandhi nukes everybody. But you know, it's like something that doesn't happen that much. Otherwise, it would just be, you know, a little bit too silly, I think.
I mean, there are two
So,
ways to
yeah.
handle glitches like that. It's you either make a running joke out of it, or you just like try to pretend it never happened, and they decided to make a joke out of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and originally that happened in the first Civ game just because all of the leaders were basically just die rolls. Like there wasn't much going on there. They would just say, "Oh, I have a nuke. Do I shoot it? Let me roll a d6. Oh, it's a 6. Here go the nukes."
Well, it was also because I believe the programming thing was like Gandhi had a super low aggressiveness rating, but when you develop democracy, your aggressiveness rating goes down, and his was already so low that it underflowed.
I've heard that. I don't know if that's actually true, though. I think I asked Sid about that, and he said, I don't know. It's hard to tell. Sometimes Sid can be cryptic with his answers. Maybe he just didn't want to admit it. But yeah, so there's a strong element of character development and character management in At the Gates, but it's not historical characters. I think if I'd even tried to do that with this era, it would have been really difficult just because, you know, the number of people whose names we know at all is pretty challenging. Like some of the factions, I had trouble finding who would be the best leader for them, period, because we don't even know that many of like the kings. So yeah, it gave me some room to play around with things though, which is kind of cool. One of the disadvantages with being a designer on a game like Civilization is that you are limited in a lot of very fundamental ways. So you're making a game where there have to be knights, and there have to be, you know, there has to be Gandhi, and there have to be nukes, and you know, there's these fundamental elements that people kind of expect from a game about history, and also B, at this point, just a Civilization game. And then, you know, I touched on it a little bit earlier, but with At the Gates, it was kind of like a fresh start and say, okay, what elements do I want to pull out of here? Once I've decided, and once the game is shipped and is out there and people have played it, then those expectations will start to come in for At the Gates as well, but not to the same extent, in part because of, you know, just how much detail is out there. We have a lot of detail about all of history. We don't have that much detail about this era, so it was kind of liberating in a way. But yeah, you know, I'm sure the narrower scope will mean that fewer people are gonna check the game out. But you know, like if you make a game that's more focused, then you can make something that a lot of people still really love if you do it well. So hopefully that trade-off makes sense.
I think it does. I mean, you know, it's a super specific point in history, and you know that has its own appeal. Yeah, it's not as broad strokes as, you know, all of history, or even like the Roman Empire. Like there've been a fair amount of Roman Empire strategy games throughout the years. Caesar, Nemesis of the Roman Empire, and so on and so forth. But you know, it's like focusing on the barbarians. I can't think of one that, you know, specifically did that up until now.
Yeah, there's a couple possible examples. Could be the Total War series. There was the Attila kind of spin-off from Rome 2, which I know a lot of people liked. Some people didn't, but you know, it was a game that was out there. It was funny. It was kind of being worked on in parallel to At the Gates quite a while ago. So it was funny. Like, oh, I made the joke with some people I know. I'm like, oh, they're copying me. Clearly, Creative Assembly saw what I was doing. They're like, we need to get there first. Let's go. Probably not, but you know. And then there's King of Dragon Pass, which is a pretty popular smaller strategy game that covers a lot of similar territory to At the Gates, and was a game that inspired some of the things like the character system and like a more, you know, focus on story over just purely symmetrical competition like you see in a lot of other strategy games. Even Civilization is kind of fundamentally built upon the idea of, okay, there are X number of players out there who all start with one city and they're racing to get to the victory condition in the end. At the Gates is very much not that. It is much more about, okay, what is the challenge that I'm facing in this game? What clans do I have? What resources do I have? Do I start in the far north, surrounded by forests, and this is a game where I want to kind of expand with boats and explore the map that way? Or am I starting near the Romans in a much more fertile area, and my clans are much harder to deal with, so I'm spending a lot more time dealing with that, whereas the resource issue is maybe not as big of a deal, but I need to think more about diplomacy. Every game is going to be pretty different, and that's something that is kind of a risk a little bit, because a lot of times what people look for in a strategy game is kind of a more consistent experience, so they can kind of build up their mastery of the game and get better and better, and kind of show what they can do. At the Gates kind of pushes away from that a little bit. I've added some logic to make sure that the first few games aren't going to be too crazy. But overall, like for anybody who kind of wants a more relaxing strategy game where you can kind of just hit end turn a bunch and things will be okay, At the Gates is definitely not that.
Duly noted. Now, is there any sort of multiplayer component to At the Gates?
There isn't, and this is something I talked a little bit about on Twitter, actually, last week. It's not that I have anything against multiplayer. I mean, I have literally thousands of hours of multiplayer Civ games under my belt over a decade now. It's just really hard to do. For one, that's one element. So when you're a smaller developer, especially indie developer making a strategy game, it's just a huge amount of work. I would estimate, I don't know, maybe 30 to 50% more work to make the game, just because of how you have to structure things in code and how you have to do certain things. You have to be very disciplined with how you send information around within the code. So it's quite a challenge. Additionally, on the design side, it shapes how you design your game. So if you're designing a game with multiplayer in mind, you're automatically being pushed in a more symmetrical direction where everybody has kind of a fair start. Everybody, the pacing is going to be roughly equal. Like, even if you think about more asymmetric strategy games, something like StarCraft, where you have three different, very differentiated factions, they are designed to be balanced against each other over the course of a full game, very, very specifically. Like, game balance is one of the most important things in StarCraft. And that's certainly less true in a game like Civilization, but still the idea of just, okay, we have 8 factions, they all start with a city, that is kind of limiting. Whereas being able to say, we're not going to do multiplayer with At the Gates. We're going to make it a single player only game. What does that let us do? What does that let us try? And that was something that I embraced basically from day one. So I knew right from the beginning that the game wouldn't have multiplayer and it wouldn't be designed with multiplayer in mind. With future games, I think that's going to be different because I will have more people, I'll have more time, just across the project, and it won't just be me spending my time on it. And I love multiplayer, but yeah, for At the Gates, I think it was definitely the right move because it let me do some of these really unique things in terms of making the games play differently. So no multiplayer, but it's there's something there in its place. It's not just a missing feature, I would say.
Bold strategy, no pun intended, since multiplayer is a big hook of strategy games of all types. Brand, maybe less so, but certainly 4X and real time. Anyway, we are getting low on time, so just a couple more questions from Mike Porter. Is this game being built in Windows only, or is it going to be available on Mac and Linux as well?
Yeah, so it's going to be available on all 3 platforms at release. So yeah, the release date here is a couple weeks from now, January 23rd, and it will be out on Windows, Mac, and Linux.
Okay. And is there any sort of price settled on at this point?
Yeah, so the base price of the game is going to be $30, and then for the launch week, it will be 10% off. It'll be available directly through our website. You'll be able to get a Steam key and a DRM free download that way. It'll be available on the Humble Store and of course on Steam. So if anybody is interested, you can go to the Steam store page and wish list us there, and you'll be notified as soon as the game is out.
All right. And finally, any plans for like a mobile version of this or a Nintendo Switch version, like what Civilization 6 has been doing?
It would be really cool, but I don't think so. It's built with PC very, very specifically in mind, and it would take a while to switch it over. It would be a lot of fun that way. I'm hoping to do that with future games, but yeah, at the gates will be PC only.
That's certainly fine and well enough. I mean, it's like if you've built a game for a specific platform, it's sometimes best to keep it on that platform. We've encountered badly ported games, let's just say.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, it's not something I would ever want to do poorly. I think it is the kind of game that would be awesome to play out kind of on your iPad on the couch, but it would just be tough to get that there. But yeah, even if I do ever kind of push my games to mobile, it's not something I would ever compromise in terms of gameplay, and I would want to make sure that the interface was good as well. So that's one of the reasons why it's not going to happen this time, because I don't want to do it and then do a bad job.
That's perfectly sensible from my vantage point. Anyway, one last check for final questions from the rest of the team here.
Do you have like a tutorial or whatever for somebody who doesn't really play 4X strategy that would make this like a good jumping in point, or is this more if you're not really versed, this isn't really a place you should start?
It would be a tough place to start. So there is some game help, and there's a cool new feature that I've added with At the Gates called tooltips and tooltips. Basically, if you just mouse over any concept word, you get a tooltip, and then you can mouse over concept words inside other tooltips, so you can kind of go on forever. I kind of like to call it like Wikipedia in tooltips. So you can kind of dig in that way, but there is just such a broad scope of stuff that it would be hard to learn the game specifically that way. At release, I'm going to have like a 10-minute, how to play At the Gates YouTube tutorial video where I kind of talk about the basics. And there will be some in-game help, like I said, but yeah, it would be tough. I would say probably starting with Civ and just seeing if there's something there for you might make more sense, but I'm sure there will be a number of people who kind of jump into the genre through At the Gates, and I have put a lot of work into the interface and some of the learning tools. So, yeah, it's not going to be easy, but I think it would be rewarding for the people who that sort of gameplay appeals to.
All right, I think that's it for me.
No, no actual multiplayer, but I assume there's some random generation stuff. So, is there a way to share seeds, as it were, to make sure you and someone else are playing the same starting point?
Yes, yeah. So there's a way to kind of tell the game what seed you want to use. So it's like a 6-letter game seed with a dash in the middle. So you can basically say, I want to play on this game seed, and then you can play the same exact map and clans and setup as somebody else. So
because that way you can theoretically do like competitive runs or something just against someone else.
Yeah, exactly. That's something that I've been thinking a lot about, and the system is kind of set up for that, kind of having like weekly challenge games or something like that. So we don't want to have any specific infrastructure set up for that yet, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about, and the game is really well suited for it. So I'm sure at some point, maybe not right at release, but that's something I want to explore with this game, because it really is inspired by those sorts of roguelike games where you can kind of compete against other people indirectly.
All right then. So I think that'll about do it for this interview. John, I want to thank you for coming out and taking time out of your schedule for being with us today. I'm certainly interested in At the Gates, and hopefully we can review the game when it gets released in a few weeks here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if Steam codes are ready yet, but we'll probably be in contact in around the time of the actual release to see you know how many can be given out and all that stuff. Because you'll note there are more. There are three of us here. We got another guy who's currently at work. Sort out the details. Anyway, it's like the game is at the gate, or more specifically, John Shafer's at the gates. Like, I think I see what was done here. Like, anyway, it's coming soon. 2 weeks, January 23rd for $30. Base price. It's going to have a 10% discount, so I think it's about $27. I'm remembering my math right. Like, anyway, it's going to be available on Steam. The Humble Store. Is it going to be on GOG?
I asked, but it looks like it won't be right now, unfortunately. I'm going to keep bugging them, but not at release.
Gatekeeping. I mean, there's some people in the world who tell me that's a good thing, but anyway, yeah. So be sure to look for it on a couple of storefronts, maybe others in the not so distant future. And yeah, that'll about do it for this installment of Fragments of Silicon. Be sure to join us for our main show tomorrow at 9:30 p.m. Eastern as we welcome John Delia of Retroware TV. A bit of a different thing this week, going back to the roots, so to speak. More on that tomorrow. Until then, I wish you good gaming.